we really look forward to Sunday. So we'll be praying for that tonight, um, and for our church and for our country. So let me just start with our devotional. I'm going to tell a story first to kind of introduce the theme. And it's a theme of victory. And this story goes way back in time to 1817. So what I've done a study on mountain history, what happened on each day of the year that was significant in a mountain setting. And by far, this is the greatest of all the stories for January 18th, and a very easy one to select out of whatever number of stories. Most of us are familiar with Hannibal and his amazing military maneuver over the Himalayan mountains, and that led to victory. Many are familiar with Napoleon, some of his exploits that were just, Waterloo, we think of him at Waterloo and a disaster, but he had some really magical, strategical, amazing maneuvers, and we still think of his name today, Napoleon Bonaparte. But this is a story that maybe many have not heard, and it took place, initiated on this day, January 18th, 1817, and the starting point is Argentina. So in Argentina, you have a number of soldiers who are following their leader, Jose de San Martin. And their desire, very much like when we broke away from England, we wanted our independence. These South American countries, which as we know them today, were at one time under a very oppressive, domineering Spanish rule. And just like we eventually were wearied with England and wanted to revolt and have our independence, so did these groups of people and future countries. And so under San Martin, the place they had to take out was Santiago, Chile. And that was where really that was the epicenter of Spanish force. And the Spanish knew it, everyone knew it. If you're going to take Chile and get your independence, it would have to go for Santiago. So San Martin's strategy, he tremendous coordination. He had two different officer groups, two officers with their groups. And what they were going to do, they were going to come in at Santiago from two different directions. And they weren't going to go all the way to fight. They were, totally outmanned and so on. But what they would do is those two movements from the north and the south of Santiago, Chile, would cause the Spanish to at least take note and react. And what San Martin was hoping is that the Spanish would take some of their soldiers and at least go north and explore that possible attack, and then send some of their troops south with that bluff that was coming at them, and basically reduce the troops. The Spanish had far more soldiers, very trained, very well equipped. And so San Martin thought the only way we're going to be able to really have victory is two things: to divide and conquer, and to take them by surprise. And so in coordination with those two movements that were bluffing the Spaniards, San Martin is going to lead 3,500 soldiers east to west over the Andes Mountains. And this maneuver rivals Hannibal's exploits over the Himalayas. So this is, they say, one of the three most remarkable mountain movements in the history of the world, in military history. So San Martin takes his men. The route he's going to take is through passes. They have horses, rough, still very dangerous. He will lose 1/3 of his men, almost 1/3 of his men on the journey. He's going to travel 1,600 miles. And they're going to do it in just record time. They're going to get over those mountains in 21 days. So they're pushing like crazy. And they're trying to coordinate this surprise attack off the mountains while the two Spanish groups are going after the two bluff movements. And so San Martin maneuvers his guys, amazing coordination to have the food that they needed on the route, and just the endurance just to go ridiculous amount of time, each day. You're talking 100 plus miles, nearly, 75 miles or whatever a day. Remarkable, journey under horrific conditions. And so he led that attack starting on January 18th. He gets over the Andes, and as they hoped, the Spanish would fall for the two movements north and south of them, leaving fewer men there in Santiago. They're just a little above sea level. And sure enough, when San Martin came up with those slopes, no one was expecting an army of a couple thousand people to come out of nowhere, and they did. And as a result, they took over Santiago. And there's a city, they wanted to make San Martin basically the governor of the city. He said, no, I have other fish to catch. And his goal was Lima, Peru. He wanted to continue to deliver his people. And as a result, they would have their independence, and they would take possession of the land, and they would crush this powerhouse that had basically controlled the land for a rather lengthy time. So this day in mountain history, the story of Jose de San Martin, and they often call it the Army of the Andes. So a great story in mountain history. So with this introduction, I'd like to talk about another story, but in this case, a mountain story in the Bible, and it comes to a lot of parallels. We're going to talk about one of God's people in this case, using a mountain in a unique way. He's in hostile territory. Ultimately, he wants to defeat an oppressive enemy and ultimately possess the promised land. And to do so, there was going to have to be war. And just like San Martin, there'd be faith, there'd be endurance, there'd be courage, and certainly they would have to fight. So I'm going to share the story here in Exodus 17. And if your goal this year is to read through the Bible in 1 year, you're reading 3.2 chapters a day. And with the reading schedule I sent out this past weekend, and we used the same schedule last year, and we'll probably use the same one next year, and so on, you would be reading chapters 17 through 20 in Exodus. And for those searching for mountain peaks, there's 20 mountain peaks in these 4 chapters. So this is one of the large mountain ranges of Scripture. So in chapter 17 and in verse 8, we have the story of the victory over the Amalekites. And I'll begin here reading. Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim. So the Amalekites had been there in this land for a good while. This is their home. This is their house. And they don't like the idea that this foreign entity is marching through their property. And they are not Yahweh followers. These are pagans. They are hostile, and they're going to end this group of people known as Israel. So they fight here with Israel in Rephidim. And then Moses says to Joshua, choose us some men and go out, fight with Amalek. So Moses is leading a lot of people, but most of those people weren't qualified for this kind of fighting. You had older men, older women, you had boys and girls. And then Israel really hadn't had much military history for 400 plus years there in Egypt. So they're not equipped. When they left Egypt, it wasn't like they were outfitted for war. So they have a lot of shortcomings here. But Moses says, look, to Joshua, let's get some guys, and we've got to fight. We can't run from Amalek. That's not a solution. We've got to confront them. We've got to go to war. And there's a real battle that's going to take place. And then he says, tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. So he said, now tomorrow you're going to take the man Joshua and fight, but I'm going to intercede with God for you. I'll intercede for you with God from the top of the hill, that he'll give you the victory, that we'll have, we'll defeat, as a nation, we'll defeat Amalek and his people. And of course, that rod that he has in his hand was just used in the previous paragraph where they were wandering through the wilderness and they were without water. And people were starting to get pretty nervous about that and complaining. And Moses seeks the Lord, and the Lord tells him to strike that rock there in Horeb and outflowed the water to provide. But he struck it with the rod. And it would be the same rod that he would strike the Red Sea, and they would miraculously cross. So it pictures the power of God, the authority of God, God's authoritative work and word. And so he says, tomorrow I'm going to go to the top of the hill. And and for us who live in Colorado, we love our mountains, and we understand going to the top of the hill. We walked, I don't know, 3 miles tonight. There's nothing flat up here, so one way or another, you're going to go to the top of the hill. And as we were coming up Human Way up to our cabin, our dog is off his leash. We didn't see one car. I mean, there's no one out, and he's running up and down the hills, effortlessly. And he's a big hunting dog, but we found it quite amusing. About 20 yards off of the dirt road that we were walking on is this monster buck. And he's just standing there looking at us. And our dog has been trying to hunt deer on the whole trip. And he was not successful. I didn't even see the deer. But the deer would bolt to the top of the hill. And it takes effort to get to the top of the hill. And Moses is a mountain climber. He's going to climb Mount Sinai. He's going to go up other mountains. But here he's on top of this hill the next day. So what happens, he goes here as planned. So Joshua did as Moses said to him, and he fought with Amalek. And Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Obviously, maybe they think they're closer to God, but obviously it's a great vantage point to watch the battle below. And so they go to the top of the hill. They're between heaven and the battle. They're in a great position of mediation or intercession. And so it was when Moses held up his hand that Israel prevailed. So if those soldiers could look up the hill, they would see their leader and his assistants up there on the top of the hill. And that man who held the rod that smote the rock in Horeb, and that man who held the rod that saw the Red Seas smote, they're encouraged when they can see his hand up in the air, holding that rod. And so as long as he could hold his hand up in the air, with holding that rod, they prevailed. They would be taking the day. And when he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. So what we have here is a tremendous conflict between Amalek and his people and Joshua and his. And it looks like almost like the battle we face daily between our flesh and the spirit. It's a real battle, and it's hard to always be yielding to the spirit and always being victorious. But so we should be. But what we have here is this story. As long as he has his hands up towards heaven with the rod, God is responding, and there's victory. And it looked like that the battle depended on Moses raising his hand. And in reality, it was God responding to his faith and trust. But there was a human responsibility seen in this action. And but what happened for the day, it says Moses' hands became heavy. And that's an unusual position to put your hands straight up, like in a touchdown position. Some football teams, maybe our Broncos, they don't have to worry. Referees don't have to worry much about that, being tired, putting their hands up. Or if you're the field goal kicker for the Cowboys, you don't have to worry about putting your hands up either. But we have here is, working above your head with your hands when you're not used to it, well, it just wears you out. Just try to do sheetrock above your head. It's miserable. So here he is holding this rod up. He's just wore out. And so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. So no longer is he standing, he's sitting. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. And his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. So the pictures, it isn't comical, but he's wore out. He sits down on a rock, so hopefully you can still see him. He still can see the battle. And his two companions here, his helpers, his associates, they uplift him by holding his hands up, and they just steady his hands and rod. And with that put into practice, the battle continues. And by the going down of the sun, it says Joshua defeated Amalek and his people with the edge of the sword. So woo-wee, what a day this was. And they didn't want to forget this day. So in the next paragraph, the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." And I'm reading from the New King James, they're translating it. For he said, because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war of Amalek from generation to generation. So a great story, San Martin's story is a great story, but this is even better. It's a biblical story on the top of a mountain. And it was a very difficult battle. There was a lot at stake. And as long as there was effective intercession, an ongoing intercession, there was victory below. And I'm thinking about life in general, but specifically this Sunday, where we are in a spiritual battle. Between now and Sunday, people are going to make decisions to invite people out or not. People who are invited will make decisions whether to come or not. And we are hoping that our church family, that we invite Asian friends out or anyone out, and that there's an audience there that needs the gospel who will hear it, and that that audience obviously will come. So part of our praying tonight is that we would do a good job inviting people and compel them to come in, that we would do a good job praying for the service, for the preached word, for the Spirit of God to work in hearts, and to bring people to Christ. And the gospel has that power to actually convert a soul, even on the first hearing. May not always happen that way, but there is that power in the word, where when it's heard, faith is developed, created, and people can respond, repent and believe, and be saved. I remember a number of years ago, we had a international dinner outside, an opportunity to preach to our friends from around the world. And it was right after 9/11. So it was 2001. And just a simple gospel message. And many there, I'm sure, for the first time, were hearing the gospel. And there was quite a few that responded that day, probably more than any other occasion, where on the first hearing, they wanted to be saved. And there was a lot of reasons maybe for that. But in our case, we have people coming, and we want to have good turnout. We want a clear gospel message, and we're just asking God to work in hearts and for people to trust the Lord. And that's a battle. And Satan doesn't want Amalek in many ways. He's like Satan. He hates the people of God, hates any progress for the people of God. And so we need to really, really pray that God will give the victory in the lives of unbelievers, that they would trust Christ, that we would work well together as a church family, work hard, and that we would be praying. And just for anything we do, that we spend our time praying for the Lord to use our ministries and to watch Him give the victory. So I love the story of San Martin. I'd like to read more about it, but I really like this story. And I heard this message once preached by one of, I think, the dearest of men, someone I just admire as much as anyone, really, as much as anyone. It was an older gentleman. He did church planting in Salt Lake City or near that area. And I met him when his son and daughter came to Clemson as grad students. And he was a missionary with Northwest Baptist Missions. And his name was John, his wife was Sue, their last name is Lovegrove. And we got to know them, and they invited us out to Salt Lake City area to work, to do some work with them, door-to-door work and whatever, I think BBS, some other things. And I had the joy of taking my oldest son, John, with me. He was maybe 5 or whatever. He wasn't very old. It was just adorable. People came to the airport and sent us off like we were going, to the moon. And we were received like Mormon missionaries when we got back. I mean, it was like incredible, John and I trip. And we really had a blast there. But John Lovegrove was just one of these steady guys, loved the Mormon people, just a plotter, steadfast, unmovable kind of guy. And they endured years and years of ministry there, and then they went up to Idaho, Rigby, Idaho, to do a work and so on. But he lived the message he preached. The message he preached to us was this passage, and he really asked our church and churches like ours, I'm sure, to pray for him, to lift his hands up as he served the Lord there in Utah in some very difficult surroundings. And we really need to uphold the preacher, Jeff Musgrave, always to pray for your pastors, those serving the Lord in whatever capacity, whether they're pastors or not, but to pray for one another, to hold up people's hands in this battle that we're in. And certainly in our country, we got to uphold those that are, in key positions of influence. We have to pray. And I really wonder that we have faced some defeats as a nation. And I wonder if it's because the Christian hasn't really been interceding or praying. And we're to pray for those in authority. And I hope that we will do that. So tonight,